Have you ever seen one of those really cool visual effects loops from Peter Quinn? Well, today we're gonna make one. Peter Quinn is this amazing visual effects artist, After Effects artist, and over the years, he's kind of made a name for himself on social media, putting together these really clever, quirky, cool visual effects videos, doing basic After Effects tricks just really, really effectively. And since then, he's worked with Will Smith, James Corden, Michael Bublé, and Snoop Dogg, to name a few. And so I emailed him and I said, hey, is it okay if I try to recreate one of these and make a tutorial out of it? And he said yes. So thank you, Peter. Let's get to it. Now, the beginning of the process is you need to shoot some footage. I went to Peter's Instagram page and he's got some really cool behind the scenes footage that I used to kind of figure out how he was actually pulling this off. Now, I wanted to shoot this on my iPhone just so that I could show you that you don't actually need professional video equipment to do this. So I have the iPhone 13 Pro, which has a really good camera, but there's actually a secret to making that camera even better. That secret is an app called Filmic Pro. You can get it in the App Store, and it lets you shoot with a much more powerful camera app. You can increase the quality, and most importantly, it lets you lock the exposure and lock the focus on the camera because you need those things to stay really, really still when you're doing special effects using this technique. I grabbed a spare tripod I had and I put this little iPhone adapter on it, and I got that when I bought my SwitchPod, which is a really, really useful piece of gear. It's created by my buddy Pat Flynn, so check that out. I also use my pop-up green screen, which I bought off of Amazon. And now that everything's captured, let's go into After Effects and comp it together. All right, so first let's take a look at our footage. So this is the longest clip that I took. It's about 1.5 minutes long, and what I did was just let it run for about 10 seconds with nothing in it. This is called a background plate, and no matter what kind of visual effects you're shooting, it's always good to shoot a background plate. Joey, what's a background plate? I'm glad you asked. A background plate is essentially the scene with nothing in it. If I'm gonna be an actor in this, and there's also gonna be, I don't know, maybe some leaves and some dust, and obviously a hand coming in to flick me, those are foreground elements. The background, I want that clean in case I need to erase things from the foreground as I'm doing the visual effects. So I chose this spot in my yard very deliberately. You can see that the tree is casting shadow, and I'm basically standing and I have my tripod positioned right at the edge of that shadow. And there's a good reason for that. You have to think through the entire shot. If I'm gonna be running towards camera and getting flicked and flying back against the tree, well, if I'm in shade when I'm near the tree, but then I'm in the sunlight when I leave the tree, that's gonna be a pretty drastic lighting change. That lighting change isn't actually going to happen because I'm doing a visual effect here. I'm gonna jump up in the air and make it look like I'm being thrown back into the tree. That's obviously not actually happening, and so the lighting change won't happen. So the best thing to do is not have to do that. Just make sure that I'm in a spot where visually, I'm gonna be in shade the entire time. And so that's why I picked this spot. I also tried very hard to make sure that nothing really big was gonna be moving in the shot. You can see that the leaves are moving, the wind was blowing a little bit. There's nothing else here that could blow around. I made sure my dog was locked inside, because anything that's moving is gonna be a dead giveaway when I try to loop this. So then I took a cue from Will Smith. I watched how he did it and basically just stood near the tree and kind of got ready and threw myself against it, okay? And I'll be honest here, I didn't really throw myself very hard against the tree, and I regret that because I think it would have worked better if I'd sacrificed my back a little bit, but I'm 41 and I'm just not doing that anymore. So I throw or, just sort of gently toss myself against the tree. Then I ran towards the camera. Now, notice this branch strategically placed right there. So that was my mark. I wanted to make sure I knew exactly where to stand. Before I shot this, I kind of stuck my hand in front of the camera in flick position and kind of figured out where I needed to be when I ran to the camera to accept that flick in the right spot. And then I put a stick there so I knew where to stop. So I run to the mark and I stop. And then I kind of stood there for a few seconds. The reason I waited was because I didn't know exactly what the timing was going to be of my hand coming out and flicking me. And I kind of wanted the option to have that flick be delayed by a second or two, or it could happen instantly. And by standing there and trying to be relatively still, I figured as soon as the flick hits me, I'm going to move instantly. So I can just cut to the shot of me being hit. So as long as I'm relatively in the same position, it's going to work. Now, my daughter actually complimented me on my extension here. Look at this. Right? I moved pretty good for a 41-year-old. And what I was thinking about was I knew I was going to rotoscope a few frames of myself, and I needed something that would look kind of ridiculous, like this or this, and that I'd be able to position and scale through the scene back into the tree. And I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how that pose turned out. After that, you can see I went and I collected a pile of leaves. I live in Florida, so we don't actually have fall, but there were some leaves on the ground, so it worked out. And I had the idea of having maybe some leaves kind of pop out of the tree when I hit it. I just thought that might be a nice little impact, and so I literally just threw them up in the air by the tree. And at this point, I wasn't even sure how I was gonna use them. I just thought, oh, this might be cool. And when you're gathering material like this, when you're shooting a shot, I think it's always better to have more footage and not use it than to wish you had that footage later. So don't be afraid to shoot a lot when you're doing stuff like this. And that is the end of this clip. Now let's look at this one. So this is just a clip of me throwing dirt against the tree. And this was the same idea as the leaves. I grabbed some dirt and mulch and I tried to stand out of the way. I was really trying to get out of the line of sight from the camera to the tree. I didn't want to block the tree. I wanted it to feel like there was like a burst of bark or something when I hit the tree. So I just tried to throw it against the tree without having my hand cross the tree, because then I'd have to rotoscope it and replace it. So then I threw this pile of mulch, and you can see that my hand did actually touch the tree a little bit. So I sort of failed in my attempt to avoid doing that. In the end, it's gonna be just fine because my body is gonna be blocking that part of the shot anyway. But it does have this nice effect. If we zoom in, you can see it even better. It is kind of a nice little burst of just detail, something happening when I hit the tree. Finally, I was holding my pop-up green screen in my left hand, and then with my right hand trying to line up my flicking hand. And I did a whole bunch of different takes here. I did different speeds and tried to tilt my hand different ways to find just the right angle. And in the end, I sort of ended up with something like this. Now you can see this is a pretty bad green screen right here. It's really wrinkly. I didn't steam it or do anything like that. The lighting's pretty uneven because I was kind of in the shade, but it was moving. The angle was changing. You're gonna see that there's some tricks you can use and make it okay, even though the green screen isn't like the perfect scenario. So don't be afraid to try this stuff. Even if you have a green piece of cardboard, you can make this work. Now, before we get into this, I want to say that it's really, really helpful to practice this kind of stuff. So if you would like to practice or follow along, you can download this footage for free at schoolofmotion.com. The link is in the description, or go out and shoot this yourself. It's really a lot of fun, takes about 5 minutes, and then you can impress your friends. All right, so now that's our footage. Let's start assembling this thing. The first thing I want to do is lay down the background plate. So I'm going to grab this first clip, bring it into my timeline, and this is a 4K clip, but this is a 1080 by 1920 scene. So I'm going to hit Command Option F to scale my shot to the comp. And the reason I shot it in 4K is because I figured A, it would make the keying and the roto a little bit easier to have more detail, but also I thought that might be nice because then I can kind of reposition the shot without losing detail. So all we need here is just a nice clean part of the shot to use as the background plate, and we've got it. So this is done. I'm just gonna label this BG plate. Now I'm gonna duplicate this and I'm gonna call this Joey Run. And now let me just give this another color, make this a little bit easier to see. I'm gonna turn the sound off and I'm gonna double click this. So when you double click a layer in the timeline like this, it opens up the layer viewer. And in the layer viewer, I can easily scrub through the entire shot, even though my comp is only about 4.5 seconds long. And this is really great because now I can kind of scrub through and find exactly where I want my shot's endpoint to be, which is gonna be somewhere around here where I throw myself into the tree. If you hold your mouse over any window in After Effects and hit the tilde key, it will go full screen, and then I can hit the period key to zoom in. And boy, did I pick an awesome frame to freeze on. So I'm using page up and page down, and I'm gonna kind of go backwards and forwards and try to figure out where I want this shot to begin. By the way, this is clearly Oscar-winning acting. So I'm gonna be flying into the tree, and at some point I'm gonna have to transition to this shot. And so I wanna maybe have some of that original momentum. So maybe right before I start going backwards, maybe like here would be a good first frame. So I'm gonna hold Option and hit the left bracket key. And I want you to notice what happened down here when I did that. It trimmed that layer. So now I can hit the space bar to play, and I'm gonna go forward until I stop, right about here. I'm going page down to get to the end. I'm gonna grab a little bit more of the shot than I need. I'm gonna hold Option and hit right bracket, and now I've set an in and an out point. I can hit the tilde key to jump back out, and then Shift /. This is a really handy one. This will zoom your comp to fill the comp viewer no matter how big you've made it. So it's just a really good way to see your entire comp. And now I can close this layer browser and I'm back in my composition here. Now you can see I have my in and out point set on this layer, but that layer is probably way over here to the right somewhere. So what I'm gonna do is go to my first frame And with that layer selected, hit the left bracket button, which is going to bring the endpoint of this layer all the way back to where my playhead is. And now it's lined up correctly. All right, so this comp is not long enough. Let's add some time to it. I'm gonna hit Command K and bring up my composition settings. And I'm just gonna set this to 8 seconds. I don't know how long it needs to be just yet, but that should be plenty. And so now let's go to where the flick should happen. The flick's gonna happen somewhere around here. So one thing I like to do is use comp markers or layer markers to kind of rough out the timings, right? So if I'm running here and I land, boom, that's kind of where I want that flick to happen. I'm kind of feeling the timing, right where I snap my fingers. And I'm gonna do this again, but instead of snapping my fingers, I'm gonna hit the asterisk key on my number pad. So I'm gonna hit space bar and I'm running, I'm jumping, bam, right there. Now you see when I hit that asterisk key, it left a marker right there. This is a trick I do all the time. I'll play back my animation, or in this case, just the video, and I'll use that asterisk key to set a timeline marker, or in this case, a layer marker, interactively, because as an animator, sometimes you can kind of feel where things need to be, but it's hard to figure that out when you're going frame by frame. It's easier when it's playing and you can just tap a key. So if the flick's gonna happen here, now we can actually grab our flick footage and start lining it up. So that's gonna be this clip here with the green screen. So let me bring this down. Let's rename this flick. Let's give it a different color. And then let's double click this and let's find the shot that we want. So tilde to go full screen. And I remember liking, I think, the very last take here. So let's just go here and I'm gonna hit Option left bracket and let's play this. Cool, I think that one's good, but just in case, let's check out the one before it. Now, I actually like this one better, and I'll tell you why. It's because the finger, when it flicks, it moves a little bit slower, but I think that's actually gonna feel nice. You're gonna be able to really see that finger extend out and hit me. So let's use this take. I'm gonna go back to the frame right before it enters. I'm gonna hit Option left bracket, go forward until the hand leaves the frame again, and then Option right bracket. Okay, now I gotta do the same thing. I go back to the first frame and hit left bracket to bring the shot there. Then I can close this layer. And back in the composition, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go frame by frame until that flick happens. It's right about there, okay? On this frame, the finger should be hitting me. So on this layer, I'm gonna make sure it's selected, hit asterisk, and leave a marker there. Now notice I have a marker where the flick happens on this layer, and now I have a marker where the flick should happen on this layer, and all I have to do is line those up, and I have my timing. And if I just bring the transparency down a little bit, I can actually kind of see how this feels. Boom, okay? Cool, so right on that frame, that's where I need to transition out of this footage layer into the beautiful take of me jumping up in the air. So let me select this layer and I'm gonna hit Option right bracket to trim the out point of that layer. So on the very next frame, that's where I'm gonna wanna be up in the air, hit by this gigantic hand. And also you may have noticed that this layer is gigantic. It's outside the bounds of the comp. That's because I forgot to scale it down. So Command Option F to fit to frame, and there it is. And it already looks kind of cool. It looks like it, sort of makes me disappear right as it hits me. So now let's duplicate the Joey Run layer and let's rename this Joey Fly. I'm gonna control click on this layer marker and say delete this marker because I don't need it anymore. And then I'm gonna double click the layer and we're gonna do the same thing. We are gonna set an in and out point for me jumping in the air hit by that finger, okay? So what I need to do is take the out point and pull it way over here. The reason is if I don't do that and I try and set an in point that is to the right of the existing out point, it won't work right. So if you're gonna be setting a new in point, you need to drag the out point way over so you sort of have the handles that you can play with when you set the new in. So when I get hit by the finger, the first frame I wanna see is that probably. Like I want it to feel instantaneous. And oh boy, that is what you want right there. That is what it looks like when you get hit by a giant finger. So let's hold Option and hit left bracket. And let's go frame by frame through the shot and think about where we want it to end. If we go back to the composition and we think about what's happening, right? So I'm gonna be thrown through the air by this finger, and then we're gonna cut to this shot, right? And in this shot, my legs are already kind of on the ground. So the closer I can get the flying through the air pose to match this, the more seamless it's gonna end up looking. So it's probably gonna make sense to go through this shot all the way until my legs touch the ground right there and then transition back to the other shot. So let me hold Option right bracket, and that's what we're gonna use. So let's close the layer viewer and take a look at this comp, and we can sort of roughly line this up and see what it's gonna look like. And you can see that's already working pretty well. It kind of works surprisingly well considering there's just a jump cut there. But this is the value of planning. I really studied what Peter did in his version of this, and I really thought through all of the steps I was gonna have to take. And so if you don't do that, you might find yourself trying to comp a shot and realizing something doesn't quite line up or you don't have exactly the ingredients you need. There's room for improvisation when you're doing this stuff, but you really can't beat good planning. All right, so I don't know how long I'm gonna be flying through the air here. I may actually want a few more frames than this, but for now, let's just assume that me flying through the air is gonna last exactly as long as this little clip of me in the air. So then the last part of the shot, the part that needs to go here, is this part of the shot. This is kind of where the loop point is gonna be. So let me duplicate this, and I'll call this Joey Run End, and let's move this layer over here so that it starts right after the clip of me in the air. And what I need to do is animate the clip of me in the air, shrinking and going back against the tree, and I need to end up in the same position as I am in this layer. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna go to the endpoint, and I'm gonna hold Option and hit S, P, and maybe R, because I don't know if I'm gonna need a rotation keyframe, but just in case I do, I have one. Then I'm gonna hit O to go to the end. And here I'm gonna zoom in because I wanna be able to see the tree really well. I'm gonna extend the Joey Run End layer back one frame so that there's some overlap. Then I'm gonna turn down the opacity on the Joey Fly layer temporarily so that I can see both layers. And I can turn this flick layer off so it's easier to see. So then what I wanna do is animate this layer here by scaling it down and moving myself back and trying to get in roughly the same size and position. And using my feet is actually a pretty good way to do that. And it looks like I'm actually pretty close right there. So let's turn the opacity back up. And this is gonna be very, very rough, but we should get some idea of how well it's working. All right, I can tell already that this is gonna work pretty well. All right, so we got the rough timing set up, and it's really, really important that you do this. It's really tempting to just dive in and start keying stuff and doing the roto and doing all the fun parts. But if the timing is off, what's gonna end up happening is you are going to rotoscope frames that you didn't need to, or you're gonna do all this work and then realize you need 2 more frames of something, and now it's gonna be a lot of work to go get those extra 2 frames and redo what you already did. It's better to do as much as you can to get the timing to work first. All right, so for this shot of me flying, I need to be rotoscoped. We need to completely remove me from the background so that we don't get this weird effect, which is kind of neat, but not what we're after. So what I'm gonna do is pre-compose this shot. I'm gonna hit Shift-Command-C, and I'm gonna call this Joe Fly Pre-Comp. And I'm gonna leave all of the attributes in the flick. Now, what that means is I'm pre-comping the shot, but all of the keyframes that I made remain in the master comp. That's important because I don't wanna have to mess with those or care about those when I'm rotoscoping. If I go into this comp now and I look at it, you'll see that I have the entire shot here, and it's gonna make it a little bit tricky to know where to begin and end. So what I'll do is I'll select this layer and hit I to go to the endpoint. I'll double click it, and then in this comp, in the pre-comp, I'm gonna hit B to set my comp endpoint to right there. Then go back out to the main comp and hit O, double click to go back into the pre-comp, and then hit N. And so now what I've done is I've set the in and the out point to just include the frames I need, and I know what you're thinking, I should probably stop right there. This is already comedy gold. So then what I'm gonna do is Control, click, and trim comp to work area. Now I am not in any danger of rotoscoping or doing work on frames that I don't need, and I don't want to have to do extra work. So now if I go back into the main comp, you'll see that the layer has moved because of what I just did. Not a big deal. I'm just gonna take all these keyframes, hit Command X to cut them, and then I'm gonna hit the left bracket key to bring my comp back to where my playhead is. I'm gonna reposition it and then paste those keyframes back on. Cool, so now it is set back up and I only have the frames that I need inside of this pre-comp. So now in here, what I'm gonna do is double click to go into my layer, and I'm going to grab the Roto Brush tool, which is up here. Now, the Roto Brush takes a little bit of playing around with to get the hang of. It kind of behaves in weird ways sometimes, but it does an amazing job and it will save you so much time, so trust me, it's worth learning how to use it. So I'm gonna hit the tilde key so I can go full screen here and get a little more detail. Let me also zoom in with the period. Now you can see my brush size is pretty small. So if I hold Command and then click and drag, I can increase that. And I'm gonna start by painting on the areas that I want to keep. And After Effects is pretty good at finding the boundaries of things, right? So it missed my arm, so now I'm gonna also click to include my arm. Now it included the space inside of my arm, so now I'll hold Option and click, and you'll see it turns red, and it removes that part. And it didn't do a really good job of that, so now I can make my brush smaller and hold Option and try to get these little areas here. And because I'm compositing myself back on top of the background that I was shot on, you can actually get away with really, really imperfect edges. I wanna do the best job I can, but I'm not gonna sweat the details too much. Now you do wanna spend a little more time on the first frame than probably all of the rest of them, because the way the roto brush works is whatever that first frame is, whatever features it's keeping, those are gonna propagate down throughout the rest of the shot. And so if this first frame has mistakes, those mistakes will likely propagate all the way down through the rest of your shot. So this is what it looks like right now. You can check your work a few different ways. You can come down here to these buttons, and if I click toggle alpha, you can see what the alpha channel looks like. And boy, is it janky, but don't worry about that. We'll make it look a little nicer. This is sort of the default view. I kind of like this view, this little red button, where it lets me see roughly what a composite would look like if I was composited over a red version of the shot. And so this is where you can see that even though the alpha channel looked really pretty nasty around my arms and stuff, it actually looks fine when you see it in context. So let me zoom in and fix this part of my hand. It's missing a couple of fingers, and that is probably good enough. So now what I'm gonna do is hit page down, and you'll see there will be a little bit of a pause, and then Roto Brush will attempt to rotoscope the next frame. And it did a pretty good job. There's a little spot here that I need to erase, so I can just come in and erase that spot. And then once I'm happy, I'll move to the next frame. And I wanna make sure that things like my fingers don't get lost, right? That's the kind of stuff that you might notice even if this thing's moving really fast, if the shape of my hand changes too drastically frame to frame. So I am gonna be kind of careful about that stuff. But for details like these little areas of tree that are showing through, I don't think those are really gonna make a big difference. So now I'm just going frame by frame through, and as I see something that looks like a mistake, I'm just fixing it and then moving on to the next frame. All right, and so I've made it through all of the frames. If I zoom out and take a look at this, if I play this comp, you get a rough idea of the quality of this roto, and you can see, like, especially around my hands, there's definitely some spots where the roto brush did not do a perfect job. But you also have to keep in mind that the background I'm gonna be placed on is going to match really closely all of those little problem areas, and they'll probably blend right in. And if they don't, then I can address those areas one at a time if needed. But it's always a good idea to do the least amount of roto as possible. And so I think this is probably good enough to at least see where we're at. So once I'm fairly happy with what the roto brush has done, I'm gonna come down here and click this freeze button. And this essentially just renders what the roto brush has done so that it doesn't have to process it anymore. Now I can close this layer browser and we can see what we've got here. This is now the layer. And so now if we go back to the main comp, that background should be gone. And so we should be able to actually see what this looks like. Cool, and if I turn my flick layer back on and leave it at 60% opacity, cool, it's definitely starting to work. I do kind of feel like that flick isn't powerful enough. Like maybe I actually need to move a little bit faster. So right now, this move is taking 11 frames. This is a 24 frames per second comp, so it's about half a second. So what if we made it take a third of a second, which would be 8 frames? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm gonna move these keyframes here, but remember, I need that ending pose to be the same also. So I'm also gonna hit Command-Option-T to turn on time remapping. And I'm gonna go to that last frame, which is this keyframe here. You'll notice that if I go back 1 frame, that is actually the last frame. If I zoom in, you'll be able to see. If I go to where this keyframe is with my playhead, I disappear. So you actually have to go back 1 frame when you turn on time remapping and add another keyframe there. So now that I've done that, I can count out 8 frames and then grab the keyframes and move them back. And so now that hit will happen faster, and then I just need this layer to end right when I hit the tree, so that should be the last frame, and then this is the first frame of the rest of it. There we go. Cool, so now I like the speed of it. I don't really love the trajectory yet, but we're gonna work on that in a minute. Now I think I'm ready to key the hand. So let me turn the opacity of this back up to 100, and let's go ahead and just pre-comp this. So Shift-Command-C. I'm gonna move all of the attributes into a new composition, and then I'm gonna make sure that this is checked so that it trims that composition for me. We'll just call this Flick Pre-Comp. and then we'll double click to go into this comp. And what we're gonna wanna do here is do a few steps to get a really clean key. The first thing I always do when I'm keying is I create a garbage mat. And if you don't know that term, it basically just means a rough mask around the area that you have to key that eliminates all of the easy stuff that you shouldn't even have to worry about, like areas that are really, really far from your foreground object. Like I don't need to worry about almost the top half of this frame. I can just mask that off. And actually, it's funny. There's actually a little bit of a lens flare there that I didn't notice when I was shooting. And the left side here, I don't need this either. I really only want to worry about the green right around my hand. So step one is kind of go to a frame where the hand is taking up the most amount of room that it's going to take up. And I'm just going to draw a quick rectangular mask. Then I'm going to kind of scrub back and forth through the shot and make sure that my hand doesn't leave the frame. It doesn't, that's gonna work great. So now we've already eliminated, 60% of the frame I don't have to worry about now. But what about the rest of this? Well, here's a really cool trick. What you can do is select the layer, go up to Effect, and go to Obsolete. I know, right? It's obsolete, but we're gonna use it anyway, the Color Key Effect. Now this effect is a really crappy keyer, but it renders almost instantly, very, very fast. So I'm gonna grab the eyedropper and I'm gonna click a green color really close to my hand. I don't want it to be far away because with keying, really all you care about is the edges. So I want to be close to the edge of my hand. So I'm going to click a color in there and then I'm going to crank that color tolerance up until basically all of the green goes away. All right, so all the green's gone, but you'll notice I've actually eroded into my hand and this is a terrible key, but that's okay because the next step is I'm going to go to Effect, Matte, Simple Choker, and I'm gonna set the choke mat to a negative number and watch what happens as I pull this out. So first of all, it filled in all of the holes that I accidentally caused in my hand, and now I have this really thin line of green around my hand. And if I play this shot, you see now I have the world's tightest garbage mat. There's barely any green left in there, and so it's gonna be a lot easier to key that out than this entire shot with all the wrinkles and everything on it. I'm gonna grab what I just did and pre-comp it one more time. So I'm gonna call this Flick Garbage Matte. And now I'm ready to apply the actual keying plugin, Keylight. Now I can see that the green is brighter down here than it is up here. So I'm gonna kind of split the difference and pick a green in this mid-range area here. So let me grab the eyedropper and I am going to click around the hand, and you can see basically in one click, it already looks like it did a pretty good job, but we need to double check that. So one way I like to double check keys is by using the status view. Here's what status shows you. In status, anything that is white means it is totally opaque. You cannot see through it. Anything that's gray means there's transparency, and anything that's red or black means it is see-through. And this is red because that alpha information, the transparency, is already there. This isn't being caused by the keyer. So really the only thing that concerns me is that it looks like there's a hole in my hand right here. There's transparency right here in this part of my hand. If I set this to final result, so it's actually doing the key, and I turn on transparency, kind of tough to see here, but if I hit Option 4 to bring up the alpha channel, you can actually see there's gray pixels there, which I don't want. And you can see that these edge pixels here, which should be black, are actually really, really dark gray. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hit Option 4 again to bring the normal view back up. On view, let's click combined matte so I can just see my alpha channel. So first let's touch the screen balance. Now, screen balance, it has to do with the algorithm Keylight uses, and a certain balance works better for blue screen than for green screen. And I always forget what that is, to be honest. So I'll usually just go to 0 and go to 100, see what looks better, see what works better, and then just go with that one. So if I set this to 0, you can see it basically fixes all the problems. And if I go to 100, it makes the problems worse. So I'm gonna leave it at 0. Then I'm gonna go down here to the screen matte section, and on clip black, I'm gonna bring this number up as slowly as I can. I'm using my up arrow to just nudge it up one at a time until all of that gray goes away. All right. And it's really important. I don't want to just crank this and eyeball it. I really want to be as subtle as I can get away with. And the reason for that is when you change the clip black and the clip white, you are going to affect your edges. And remember, keying is all about the edges. That's really the whole point of keying, is to get clean edges. And so the least amount you can do, that is going to maintain better edges than being heavy-handed. I don't really need to touch the clip white because that all looks pretty good. And so now this part's basically done. I can set this to final result. And I want to show you something. So you can see that there are some green pixels around the edge of my hand here. And if I turn off the alpha channel, they become even more apparent. This is called green spill. Now, when key light is set to final result, it does attempt to take care of that green spill, and sometimes it does a good job. If I set this to intermediate result, you can see what this looks like without any kind of spill suppression. And if I set it to final result, it's just not really doing much. So what I'm actually gonna do is leave this on intermediate result, which means it's gonna key the footage out. I have a perfect key, but there's still some green around the edges. It's not doing what's called spill suppression. And instead of letting key light do that, I'm gonna use another effect. So I'm gonna go down to keying and I'm gonna use the advanced spill suppressor. And the default settings on this thing basically take care of spill 90% of the time. If I turn this off and back on, you can see the problem is basically solved. Beautiful. So now let's close this pre-comp and look at it in context. Okay, so it is a pretty clean key, except we can see that there are some issues. And this is the thing about keying, is it can look perfect when you look at it on its own and then you see it in context and you realize you didn't go far enough. So let's hop back into that key. And this time I'm gonna do another trick. I'm gonna hit Command Y and I'm gonna put a solid layer behind it. And I want something pretty bright, like a bright pink, so that I can very clearly see the problems here. I don't want that bright pink solid to render though. So I'm gonna hold Control and click and turn this into a guide layer. And now what that means is that layer will not render back in the master comp. And so then I can go into key light and I can adjust the clip black up even a little bit more until that goes away. So I got rid of one problem, but there's still this black edge that doesn't look good. We can fix that in key light if we want to. We can use the screen shrink and grow property and nudge it down just a little bit at a time, and that's going to erode the edges away. And so we knocked it back almost 2 pixels. Let's just go a little bit further. And then we can soften it by maybe 1 pixel. So now we've got this nice soft edge. And when we look at this in context, it should look pretty good. I'm gonna zoom in just to get a little bit of a better look right here. And this does look pretty good. It's getting a little soft on the fingertip here. If I look, it looks like there's a little bit of transparency showing through there. And so we're gonna fix that. And it would be really helpful to be able to do that in context. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lock this comp viewer, then I'm gonna double click this pre-comp and go back to this comp. So now what I can do is adjust the key light settings while I'm seeing the results in the master comp. So if I go to clip white and I lower that, I'm gonna be bringing back some of the white pixels in my fingernail here. So I'm gonna set that down to something like 92, 93. And then the screen softness, if I set that back to 0, you can see that that made that a lot crisper. And so I think by blurring it 1 pixel, that might've been too much. So I might even just set that softness to something like a 0.2, just a little bit of softness there. And now I can unlock this and I can go back to my main comp and let's take a look at this. Cool, and that is a pretty clean key, and it just goes to show you that if you know a few tricks, even a cheap, crappy green screen that you bought off of Amazon that's really wrinkly can work in a pinch. All right, so now we need to pick a loop point, and I think it's gonna be easiest to loop when I'm back against the tree, because all the action happens in the middle here. The beginning and the end is actually pretty chill, so I should be able to find a loop point. So let's say this is the first frame, and I need to now go here and find that exact same frame. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hit B on the first frame. So now that is my comp endpoint. Let's zoom in and really look closely here. Let's try to find some landmark. So if I go forward 1 frame and I go back, you can see, okay, on this frame, the knuckles of my hand line up pretty much perfectly with this green AstroTurf here. By the way, this is what's called a Hobbit house that I built for my son. So we're gonna go forward in time and we're gonna find that exact same frame, which is probably right there. I think that is the one. So if I hit N on this and then I go back to home and I hold Shift and hit End and go back and forth, you can see that is a perfect loop, except right now that frame would be happening twice because we have it once on the beginning, once on the end. So I actually need to go backwards 1 frame, then hit N. Now we have a perfect loop. But there's a problem. My hand is in the frame here, so it isn't gonna be a perfect loop. Watch, I'll show you. So I'm looping perfectly, but the hand isn't. But now we know this is the exact length of a perfect loop. So I can just grab this, click, and drag it to something like this. And now this area should loop perfectly. Cool, so we're about halfway done with this comp. Now we're gonna get into the nitty gritty and really finesse things and polish the details and make sure that this looks as seamless as we can get it. And if you're into this sort of thing, by the way, I highly recommend you check out our visual effects course, VFX For Motion, taught by the one and only Mark Christensen. Mark has worked on many Hollywood films. He is a legend in the After Effects community. And in this class, we provide you with tons of assets, green screen footage that you can track, 3D track. We teach you how to do rotoscoping the right way, keying, 2D tracking, 3D tracking, match moving, comping 3D passes. At the end of this class, you're gonna be able to do all kinds of visual effects, and it's gonna improve your motion design work as well. So check it out, link in the description, VFX For Motion. All right, let's talk about polishing this shot. So the biggest issue I'm noticing right now is that the background has this massive shift as I'm flying through the air. Take a look at it. Okay. Now, the reason that's happening is because the shot of me running, if I solo that shot, has the background in it. We're not actually using the background plate anywhere except for this part of the shot, right? Where I'm flying through the air. And so the problem that creates is that when this layer ends and we go to the next layer, the shadow pattern has changed. So this is going to be a problem. So here's what we're going to have to do. We are going to have to draw a mask around me on this layer and animate it so that we're actually using the background plate as the background and not this layer as the background. And here's how we're gonna do that. I'm gonna hit G to bring up my mask tool, and I wanna make sure I'm in Roto Bezier mode. You'll see why in a minute. It makes it a lot easier to do rough roto like this. Then I'm gonna zoom in and I'm gonna go to this frame and I'm gonna draw a really rough shape around myself, something like this. Okay, and as soon as I finish that mask, you may have seen a little bit of a shift. So now watch, if I turn this layer on and off, you can see that the background right around me does change when that layer is on, but it's way less noticeable because the rest of the background doesn't change. Now I have to animate this thing, and that's gonna be a little bit tedious. So here's a strategy I like to use for stuff like this. I'm gonna hit Option M to create a keyframe on the first frame here. Then I'm gonna turn the mask off temporarily. I'm gonna set its mode to none, and then I'm gonna scrub forward, and right when I start moving, right about there, okay, there I'm gonna put another keyframe. I'm sort of just blocking out the rough movements. Then I'm gonna go to the end when I stop moving right there, and I'm gonna put another keyframe there. And I am just gonna get these 3 keyframes correct and then kind of split the difference and go in between them back and forth until I've got a decent roto. And we're gonna speed this up for you. Cool, so now I have a very rough mask that animates and kind of follows me. And I wanna show you why this is so important. So first I'm gonna hit F and I'm gonna feather that mask about 20 pixels just to kind of soften the edges up. Now, if I set the mask back to add and then I solo this layer, you'll be able to see what's going on here. So you can see there's still plenty of background that's kind of, following the mask. But the thing is, when I unsolo this, you're not really gonna notice that background because it's so close to the background plate. If you look really closely, you can kind of see right around here, you can see a little bit of, it almost looks like a shadows kind of following me, right? And that's just because the lighting changed a tiny, tiny bit in between me shooting the background plate and shooting this part. And so if it's too noticeable, what I can do is I can bring that mask in even a little bit closer. And I wanna make sure I'm on a keyframe when I do that so that I don't introduce even more keyframes than are necessary. The other thing that really helps is feathering the mask more. So maybe if I feather it, say, 50 pixels, it'll be even less noticeable. Now, when you do that, you do need to make sure that you're not, getting too close to the foreground because then you're gonna start to actually feather that. But I can kind of double check this really quickly. And it's never gonna be perfect, but as long as it's not super noticeable, and there's gonna be a lot of other things happening, this hand's gonna be coming in, your eye's gonna be looking here, I think it's gonna be what we call good enough for government. And so now you'll notice if you look at the background, if I scrub through when I get hit, the background doesn't change because this part of the shot is totally rotoscoped. And then this part has this kind of rough garbage mask around it, right? I'm keeping consistency with the background layer, at least enough to fool you. All I need to do now is the same thing on this part of the shot. I'm gonna have to mask myself back here, but the good news is I'm only moving about that much, so it's gonna be pretty quick and easy. All right, so it's looking pretty clean, and now it's time to just kind of watch it a few times and notice what catches your eye. And this is actually good practice. Actually look at this and see if you can notice what's catching your eye and giving this away. So one big thing is these tree branches. When the loop resets, those branches move big time because that footage is not looping. There's also a little bit of a subtle color shift I'm noticing when we transition from this flying through the air shot. Let's zoom in here so you can see it. When we fly through the air and then we hit the tree, right there, the lighting shifts. There's no shadow on the tree happening because I'm not actually there, remember. It's a special effect. And I'm also a little bit brighter flying through the air than I am here because there was more sunlight on me. So we're gonna do a couple of things. First thing we're gonna do is I'm gonna put a levels effect on this layer where I'm flying through the air. So we're gonna go to color correction, levels, and I'm gonna put a keyframe here. I'm gonna hit U to bring up my keyframes, and then I'm gonna move that keyframe back to the beginning. So we have a clean keyframe at the beginning. Now at the end here, I need a reference because I kind of wanna match the colors of this frame, and it's gonna be hard to do that when I can't see them at the same time. So I'm gonna duplicate this shot here, and I am just gonna move this over to the side like this and move it back one frame, and then I'll move back one frame. So now I can see the frame that's about to happen and the frame that is happening, and I can even move them like this, and I can see that the skin on my head, my big beautiful head, is a little bit darker here than it is here. So I'm gonna go into my levels effect, and I'm just gonna gently push the gamma and try to match that a little bit. It's really subtle, but I think that's gonna help a little bit if I turn it on and off. You can see it's not doing a lot, but it should help. So as I fly through the air, I'm gonna slowly get darker and darker, boom, until I end up matching color-wise the shot that comes after it. So now I can delete that layer. Now, the other thing that's missing is the shadow of me standing in front of the tree. So why don't we add that as I get closer to the tree? And that's gonna be pretty easy. What I'm gonna do is just Command Y to create a new solid, and let's just call this shadow. And it doesn't matter what color it is because I'm gonna turn it into an adjustment layer with this button right here. Then what I'm gonna do is just roughly using my pen tool, I'm gonna draw the shape of a shadow on that tree, and I'm gonna add the levels effect to it. And then what I'm gonna do is take the white output and just bring it down a little bit, and you'll see that's gonna have the illusion of creating a shadow there. I only want that shadow to exist until this frame, so Option right bracket, and then I'm gonna go frame forward and frame backwards, and I can see that it needs to be a little bit darker. So let me darken that even a little bit more, and I might even use the gamma to push that darker too. And then I can go forward and back, and now it's starting to match a little bit more. But I'm noticing that this part of the tree doesn't actually need that shadow as much, and I need to feather this. So let me hit F and feather that mask so it's not so noticeable. It's really cranked that up. And so now if I go forward and backwards, it matches a lot better. It still needs to be a little bit darker, but I can just kind of keep playing with it until it feels right to me. And that is pretty close. Let's look at it in motion and see how it feels. And that does help a little bit. Now that shadow only needs to appear as I get close to the tree. So what I'm gonna do is start this layer here, Option left bracket. I'm gonna hit Option T to add a opacity keyframe. Then I'm gonna turn it to 0, and then I'm gonna go forward until this last frame and turn it to 100. So that shadow is gonna sort of fade up as I get close to the tree, and then that layer is gone. A subtle little thing, but let's see if that made any difference. Cool, so little things like that, it all starts to add up, all right? So what's next? I'd like to fix the issue with the leaves where they sort of jump at the end of the loop. And so here's how I'm gonna fix that. I'm gonna use a little bit of sleight of hand. Why don't I go ahead and trim this comp to the work area since we don't need the extra frames. So now we have our comp trimmed to the loop. For this background plate, you can see that the layer in and out point are set. And so now I can just pre-comp this layer, and let's call this BG loop. Move all the attributes into the new composition and trim that comp. So now if we go in here, here is our background and we need it to loop. All right, so let's think about what we need to do. This is the first frame of the shot. This is the last frame. I need the last frame to transition very nicely into this first frame, meaning whatever frame comes right before this one, that's what I want to be the last frame of my comp. I hope that makes sense. So let's duplicate this. Let's move it forward 1 frame, Option page down. Let me zoom in here, and then I'm gonna pull this back. So this frame right here, this should be the last frame of the comp. In fact, I'm gonna hit the asterisk key to add a marker there. Then I'm gonna go to the end of the comp and I'm gonna drag this all the way over. So now that is actually the last frame. So now if I go back here and I hit Option left bracket, I've got extra frames here that lead into the frame that I'd like to be the last frame. So what happens if I put a transparency keyframe on here, opacity 0%, and then I fade it up so that on the last frame it's at 100%, okay? So now if I just loop this a few times, now watch these branches right here. Okay, so right there, that's where the transition happens, okay? Now it's happening slowly enough that you kind of notice it. What I want to figure out is how can I get away with this without you noticing, okay? And so what I'm gonna try is just doing this quicker and quicker and maybe even adding easing to this to see if that helps kind of soften it. And if I just kind of scrub through, you can see that these are the frames where it looks a little funky. And what you can even play with is kind of fading at different points in the shot because these leaves may line up better at different points than at other points. So this is kind of a little bit of experimenting to try to figure out where's the right place to put these keyframes and kind of hide that transition, hide that trick you're doing. Another way to look at this is that if there's nothing going on in the shot, your viewer's eye might notice that. But if there's something going on that they're gonna be focused on, like if I hit the tree, that's a big part of the shot right there, right? You're focused right there. You're not looking at these leaves. So that would also be a good time to, swap those layers out. So with my playhead here in the main comp, I can go into my background loop comp and I could see that's basically right at the beginning here. So why don't I set these keyframes right back at the beginning and try to get that transition to happen really quickly? What if it's only a few frames, right? You may not even notice that. That might actually be unnoticeable because I'm hitting the tree right at that moment, right? Literally. So let's take a look at this full screen. And you know the trick, so you're gonna notice it, but try to put yourself in the viewer's shoes. Cool. If you did not know what was going on, you didn't know to look here, you would probably never notice that transition because look, your eye is going here, and then here, and that's when it happens, right? So you're being fooled. I fooled you. So my eye is also noticing something else right here. When I land on the tree, boom, right there, this area gets lighter than it is here. And so I could play with the shape of this, this shadow kind of mask that I created here and see if that fixes it. And that does help. But I think really what's going on is when I'm here, I'm actually casting a shadow there, and I'm not here. So I'd like to darken this part of the frame, but this is too dark. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep the shadow there, but then with this layer selected, I'm actually gonna draw another mask on top of it, just in that area, but I'm gonna set that mask to subtract. And then I'm gonna feather that mask by 50 pixels, and I'm gonna open up the mask options, and the mask opacity is now gonna be controllable where I can have that mask subtract, but only a little bit. It doesn't totally subtract, just a little bit so that it kind of lightens that area back up. So now if I page up, page down, it's just helping kind of cover that up just a little bit more. It just kind of caught my eye. And to be honest, I don't know if I would have been able to sleep tonight unless I did what I could to fix it. So there's still a little bit of a hit there, but hopefully most people won't notice it. And actually, I think that that's working a lot better. All right, so now we're down to the final details. So remember, I threw some leaves up in the air and I threw some mulch against the tree and I want to comp those in. So why don't we start with the leaves, and what I can just do is duplicate one of these Joey Run layers. I'll just duplicate it, and let's name this leaves. Let's make it another color, and let's double click it and go in and find the spot we want. We don't need a mask on it yet, so let's delete the mask, and I'm just gonna go all the way to the end until we're throwing leaves up in the air, which is right here. Cool. So I'm gonna set this as the in point. So remember, I need to grab the out point, pull it way over here, then Option left bracket, play the shot down, cool, and then Option right bracket. And so now I have the in and the out set on the leaves layer. We can close this and go back into the main composition. And let's figure out where those leaves should appear. It should be right when I hit the tree, which is right there. That's where I want those leaves kind of up in the air. So I'm gonna hit left bracket to bring the in point to this part of the shot. And let's zoom in here. And I am gonna need to mask this, so I only have the part of the shot with the leaves in it. So if I go forward in time, there we go. So the leaves, I'm actually gonna have to fade them out because otherwise the loop won't work, but that's okay. So I just want the leaves right about here. That's where they're gonna end. So I'm just gonna draw a rough mask where I can kind of see those leaves. And then I'm going to feather this by, I don't know, let's say 50 pixels. And I'm gonna move this layer behind me, but above the background, okay? And this is one of the reasons it's so important to be very careful and not touch your camera at all when you're shooting on a tripod like this, because everything lines up to the pixel and it's really easy to do layering like this. So if we scrub through this, you'll see that my hands enter the frame here. So I need to fix that. Let's solo this layer again. And let's go to where my hands leave, right there. Cool. So my knee leaves the shot there. And Option M to create a mask keyframe. All right, and then I'm gonna go to where my knee is still kind of in the frame. I'll put another keyframe there. And then I'm gonna go back to the beginning, right about here, and I'm gonna totally hide the shot at this point, hide my hand. And I just wanna be really careful that I don't accidentally let my fingers slip into the shot. Cool, and I think those leaves actually go a little bit higher, so I'm gonna increase the size of the mask a little bit up here and go to the end and do the same thing. And that should do the trick. So now we should see leaves behind me when I hit the tree. Cool, now the timing isn't really perfect. So what I'm gonna do is slide this layer back so that right when I hit, there's some leaves already coming into the frame. There we go. Cool, so let's take a look at this. Awesome, and I think that mask even needs to go a little bit higher. Those leaves actually kind of fly up pretty high. So I can grab these mask points and push them up even higher and make sure that I don't need to raise these a little bit, which I probably do. Cool, so let's see how the timing of this feels. Cool, it's cool. It feels like a little bit of an impact. I'm digging that. So now we can do the same thing with the dirt shot. I'm just gonna drag that down into my comp. I'm gonna make that a layer orange as well. Double click it. Let's go find the spot where the dirt hits, which is right there. So I probably don't need anything before this frame, so I can use that as the first frame. I can go forward until all the dirt hits the ground, turn it off there. Then we can close this. We can go here, left bracket, line it up with where the leaves hit. Now, this layer has not been resized. You can see it's still too big, so Option Command F to fit to frame. Zoom back in and let's mask it, and let's mask it on the last frame, right? So let's see how big it really spreads out. So I'm gonna have to mask it probably all the way out to here, and then I'll go in and I'll make sure that you don't see my leg like that. I'm gonna turn on a mask feather of 50, and then I'm gonna put a mask keyframe there, and I'm gonna go back to the beginning, and I'm gonna adjust it and just roto myself out really quickly. Cool, and that dirt is coming in a little bit early, so I'm gonna push that layer back until there. There we go. Cool, now one problem, if I solo the background plate and then I solo the leaves, and then I turn the dirt layer on, you'll see the dirt layer covers up the leaf layer. That is a problem. So how can we get it so that we can see both the dirt and the leaves? So there's no way to do this perfectly the way we shot it, but what we can do is use transfer modes to get close. So if you think about it, this dirt is just really kind of dark, right? It's very dark. And so it's probably darker than the pixels underneath it. And that is gonna be useful if you use a mode like darken, which will basically leave pixels that are darker than pixels underneath them. So now you can see the dirt and the leaves. It's not perfect, but it's so small in the frame and it's really just more of like a textural thing. It should actually work pretty well. I mean, to be honest, it's actually kind of shocking at how well this stupid effect worked. So now if we turn all the rest of the layers back on and let's take a preview of our shot. Cool, all right, so now we just need to make sure that the dirt and the leaves fade out before the last frame. So let's set them to 0 opacity here. And then maybe go back 10 frames and set them back up to 100. Maybe give them a little bit longer to fade, and that should do it. Let's take a look. Yep, and that works pretty good. They fade out, but you don't really notice it because by that time, I'm already kind of up and back and running towards the camera. So now we have a almost seamless loop. And then for the final touch, one thing that Peter does on most of his videos is he adds a little bit of a fake camera move, and that really helps hide the seams, and it kind of fools you and makes you think this is really just one shot happening over and over again. So to do that, I can grab all of these layers and pre-comp them, and I can just call this Flick PC. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hit F4 to bring up my toggles here, and I wanna make this a 3D layer. The reason I wanna do that is so that then I can add a new camera and have that camera actually affect the view of this layer. I'm gonna make sure it's a 1-node camera and hit OK. And so far, nothing has changed. But if I hit R, I've got this orientation property. And if I adjust it, you can see that the shot moves around because it's kind of mimicking the camera rotating like this, like a handheld camera. And I want that to kind of move around randomly. And so the easiest thing would be hold Option, click on Orientation, and we can add a wiggle expression. And we're gonna wiggle this, so I don't know, let's say 1 time per second by 0.5 pixels, something really, really light. And if we preview this, you'll see even that is too much, right? So it's probably gonna need to be even less than that, maybe 0.5 times per second by 0.2 or something like that. So we just get a little bit of a drift, okay? Now that feels like probably the right amount of drift, but now we've got another problem. The wiggle expression creates random movement in properties, and so it's not going to loop. So how do we do that? The way you do that, my friends, is with Google. Basically anything you don't know how to do in After Effects, you just Google it, and somebody has made a tutorial. Sometimes it's even me. So this is a tutorial I found by Camp Keyframe, which is a pretty awesome YouTube channel. You should check them out as well. And they have a great tutorial about creating a looping wiggle effect. In fact, we will link to it in the description below. And here it is. This is a looping wiggle expression. You can copy it and paste it. We don't need to get into how it works, but if you're curious, you can kind of reverse engineer it. But there are some properties we need to change. We need to change the frequency, amplitude, and loop time, okay? So the frequency that we had this set at was 0.7, I believe, and then the amplitude was 0.2. And then the loop time. Okay, so this is in seconds. How many seconds should this loop last? Well, right now we are at frame 29 in our comp, and that's because it's not starting at frame 0. So let's fix that. Command K and set the start time code to 0. There we go. Now, if we go all the way to the end, we can see we are at frame 123. There's 123 frames. Great. How many seconds is that? I don't know, but we're gonna let After Effects do the math. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna put 123 and then divide that by the frame rate, which is 24. And now this should loop seamlessly. If I go to the first frame and then I hit end, you can see that the frame is in the exact same spot on both frames, meaning it will loop seamlessly. Now, there is an edge that's showing up here, but that's okay. I can just hit scale and scale this layer up just a little bit until that edge is hidden, kind of scrub through. And if you see a little bit of an edge, you can always just scale it up a little bit more. It shouldn't take much. It won't even be noticeable. And now we should have a pretty seamless loop with camera movement. Cool, that's working pretty well. And the only other thing that I think might be cool, let's check it out, is to add some motion blur on this part of the shot. Now, this was shot with a fairly high shutter speed. Typically, that's what happens when you shoot outside because there's so much light that the shutter speed has to become a lot faster so that you don't overexpose. But because I'm flying through the air so quickly, I think it'd be cool if there was motion blur, to sort of imply that I'm going really, really fast. So let's just go ahead and turn on the motion blur for the Joe Fly layer. Let's click that on and it automatically turns on motion blur. Now, the default amount of motion blur actually looks pretty good. I'm actually digging how that looks, but there's a problem. On that last frame, the motion blur turns off, and that is because my keyframes end right there. There's no more motion after that. So how could I keep the motion going so that I will get motion blur on this frame? Well, there's a really handy expression that's kind of fixes this problem, and here's what it is. If I option click on X position, you're gonna use the loop out expression, in quotation marks, type in continue, and then hit enter. What this is gonna do, it's actually really obvious if I pull up my graph editor and I turn on this setting right here so that you can see what the expression is doing. It's basically just continuing the motion at the exact same speed in the same direction. And so now I can copy the expression only off of X position, paste it onto here like this, And so now I'm getting motion blur on my last frame. All right, so let's see what that looks like. Cool. That's great. And then the one last thing that I would like to do is to just adjust the Y position arc a little bit, right? Because I'm getting flicked, and right now I'm just flying basically in a straight line. And I think it'd be cool if, as I'm flying through the air, this thing's kind of flicking me, not in a great spot. I'd like to be kind of thrown up in the air a little bit. So I'm going to add a Y position keyframe here, and I'm going to fly up in the air. And let's just kind of roughly see what that looks like. That looks pretty good. Great. Now let's go into the graph editor and let's adjust the Y position graph a little bit. Let me turn off the post expression graph on this. So I've got my Y position graph here, and I'm just going to easy ease this middle frame. I don't really need the beginning and the end to be eased. And I'm going to put a little bit of hang time on there, right? So it's going to kind of pop me up in the air. I'm going to hang there for a second, then come down and hit the tree. That's basically all I wanted to do. Let's see how that feels. This is just so ridiculous. All right, and then let's just check out the final comp here with our camera movement and all the good stuff. Well, there you go, Peter Quinn. I hope I did you proud. I know I probably missed some things, and you're probably thinking, this is just a cheap knockoff. So everybody, go check out Peter Quinn's Instagram or TikTok, whatever platform you're on. His stuff is awesome. He's got a lot of really cool examples that you can also try to reverse engineer and recreate yourself. Don't forget, you can download the footage from this if you want to try to practice or follow along with the tutorial. And definitely go to schoolofmotion.com, check out VFX For Motion if you want to learn all of these tricks and so much more from Mark Christensen. That is it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.